I'm Latashia Urbanowitz, a part of the Finding the More Ministries, and I want to share with you this evening about my walk through the valley of grief. And my hope is that I can encourage you in the midst of your loss to turn to God for your hope. And when Shalina first asked me to be a part of this, I kind of avoided the question, and she just responded with 4 simple words: don't waste your pain. So she knew that that's really my life's testimony, is to not waste the pain and to help others through what you may have experienced. So I agreed to do it. And this testimony is really about finding my way back to God, and that's why I kind of call it the long journey home. And here lately, God has had me in one particular verse, Hebrews 12:1. And when I read that verse, it's going to sound familiar because we see it a lot, but we're going to start there, and then we're going to come back to it at the end. So that verse tells us, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with such a great cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doeth so easily beset us." And this is the part where you're like, oh, I know that verse. "And let us run with patience the race that is set before us." So those last 3 words, set before us, is what we're going to come back to. But really, before we can start there, we have to go back to the beginning of my long journey home. And that starts with the loss of my mom in May of 2015. So she was my rock. She got me. She was probably one of the sweetest people that I've known or will ever know. And she was my biggest fan. She fought for me. She sacrificed for me. But on the flip side, she was also tough, right? Telling me that I should always slow down, and there was always a phrase of "don't be so stubborn." So that's where we have to start, is the loss of that. And as you hear that, it may not sound like you're the relationship with your mom or the person that you've lost. And what I've learned through this valley of grief is that not everybody has the relationship that I have with my mom. But that does not mean that you will not grieve if you've lost them, or you may even grieve for what that relationship could be. So we're going to walk through this, and I really pray that you'll be comforted by this, and realize that God can be your hope if you turn to Him. So if we start at the beginning, is with that early morning phone call. 5 a.m., my phone rings, and the other end says, "Is your mom allergic to any medication?" So my response was, "What?" And they repeat the question, and I say, "No, she's, a diabetic and has high blood pressure." And they say, "Okay, she's collapsed. The ambulance is here. We'll call you back." So it was at that moment that my life kind of turned upside down. I wasn't quite sure kind of where to start and what to do with that information. My uncle called me back and said, "Tosh, I'm going to be honest, it's not good. Your mom has not regained consciousness. They've placed her on a ventilator, and they're looking to send her to the larger hospital in Charleston." So I knew that things weren't good. So I ended that call and immediately got on the phone. I called my husband to say, what do I do? I was in Connecticut for work, and trying to figure out how to get to Charleston, West Virginia from Connecticut was not an easy task. The second phone call I made was to my cousin Nicole, and I asked her to place my mom on the prayer line. Because even though I wasn't in a relationship with God at that moment, I had grew up in church, and I knew about God, and I knew that He answered prayers, and that's why I called on my cousin to place her on the prayer line. And then kind of my third phone call, and probably a series of other phone calls, was to the airline agency to figure out, could I get from Connecticut to Charleston, and there were no direct flights. So the decision I ended up making was to fly back to Charlotte, North Carolina, and then drive 5 hours with my family to my mom. So immediately The Lord was pacing my day. He knew that some things need to get in order. He knew I needed to be surrounded by family and friends, and that it would take them time to get there. So it wasn't right away that a flight was available, but immediately I felt God's presence upon me during this hard time. So I made my way to the airport, and I found a little corner over by the window, and I had my sunglasses on, and I cried, and as I looked out that window, I remember seeing just such a great light in the sky, and I just felt His presence at that moment, and I later found out that was the time that my mom was being airlifted to the major hospital, and I was just an uneasiness. Even though I felt His presence, I kind of knew where the day was going. And I made my way onto the flight, still crying, and I can tell you, I travel a lot for work, and when I see people crying in an airport, I often wonder, are they trying to make their way to a loved one? And I'll often whisper a prayer. And I got on that plane, and the flight attendant's trying to figure out what is wrong, and she quickly takes me to the front of the plane and sits me in an aisle seat. And I can tell you, through all of my travels, that doesn't just happen. And I sat next to a lady, and I'll still remember her to this day, that she shared that she was going to see her mother that was sick, and she offered to share her snacks. And again, people just don't share snacks on the plane. And I have to chuckle because, looking back on it now, she wanted to share her snacks of carrots and celery, and I think, okay, God, could you have arranged with somebody with cupcakes to sit next to me? But I could see that, God had His hand up on me already. He knew how long this journey of that day was going to be, and He was there. He was there, and I will encourage you in the midst of your storm, He's there. You just have to open your eyes to see Him. So I land back in Charlotte, we pack, and I remember crying on my husband, just telling him, I have a feeling that I need to pack funeral clothes, and I don't want to pack funeral clothes, and him just saying, well, don't pack them. And we got into this whole debate of, well, how hard is it going to be for me to find funeral clothes? And he's like, okay, we'll pack them. And it was just a whole piece. And then we began the 5-hour drive. At times I was okay, and the closer we got to that hospital, the faster my heart raced, and I knew, kind of how this day was going to end, because each phone call, the prognosis was not good. So we walk into that hospital, and sitting in the lobby is my high school best friend. We had been messaging back and forth all day. She's a nurse, and she was trying to help me understand the things that were being said, and she had no idea what time I was going to arrive at that hospital. And it was about midnight when we arrived, and she was just sitting there. So it's really important, if you know someone that's going through a loss, all you have to do is show up. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to bring anything. She just showed up. She took my son. They went to a vending machine, and I didn't have to worry about him. So the last part of my journey, we took the elevator upstairs, and as soon as the doors opened, my family and friends were sitting there. And it broke my heart, because I knew not only were they there waiting for me, but they were waiting for me to make the tough decisions. So we went in, and I saw my mom, and even though I had all day long, to think about that, to consider that, and I'm sure I ran through a million scenarios in my mind, if you know me. But when I went into that room, she was still on the ventilator. And it took me back for a moment. I mean, I remember running to the corner and just hiding like a child. But when I turned around, I remember seeing on the wall, there was a greeting card that said, "Get well." And it puzzled me, because I'm thinking, well, who's gotten her a get well card so quickly? And then when we open it, we realize it's from the last patient, and we laugh. There were a couple of us in the room with my mom, and we laugh. And then I immediately thought, we can't laugh at a time like this. But looking back now, I know that God, He knew I needed a little relief, that my heart just needed a little bit of laughter, and He gave me that. So that the hardest part came next. And, throughout that day, I kept thinking, okay, well, this is the hardest part, getting the flight or the 5-hour drive home. But really the next part of, when the doctors came in and they're explaining her scans and there's no sign of brain activity. And then the doctor just turned and looked at me. And I didn't know what to say. And my friend, she was in the room, and she says, they're wanting you to make a decision. And I knew my mom's wishes, but as hard as it was to say those words, to turn the machine off. But God was there. Like, I remember there was just so many people around me and encouraging me in that moment. And had I had my choice, I would have gotten that phone call at 5, got on a flight immediately. But God knew what I needed. And I think we often think we know better, but He knew. He paced my day. He allowed everything to fall into place. So, with that, that's where my journey started. And immediately, very quickly after losing my mom, I had a desire to get back in church. Because I knew where my mom was at, and I knew to see her again, I had to change some things in my life. And that's the long journey home, right? Is making my way so that I can see her again. And, through that, the time that I've lost my mom till now is a lot of life lessons, and as I thought about what I was going to share when Shalina invited me, I could quickly come up with a list, but I knew I had to tailor that down a little bit. And I have 2 key things that I want to kind of share tonight that goes along with the verse. And the first one is really going to be allow God to fill that void. Because after I lost my mom, for a long time, I found myself saying, well, I wish I could call my mom to tell her this, or I wish I could call my mom to ask her about this. But I couldn't. And there was just a void. So it was almost a year to when I lost my mom. I was at my home church. It was on Mother's Day, which is a dreaded day, even till now. And these are the words that my pastor said. If your mother's in heaven, God can fill that void and love you more than she can. Now, I'm going to be honest, I didn't like those words, that moment that he said them, but as I've grown through the years and went back to that, if you're in the midst of grief, that is the answer right there. You're going to try to plug that hole with many things. You're going to try to be busy. You may be like me, you may stress eat, you may try just to substitute and fill, but God is the only thing that can fill that hole. So just, if you can turn to Him in the midst of your journey right now, you will be filled with peace, His peace. So if we look at John 14:27, it tells us, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you, not as the world gives. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. And I think we often look for peace elsewhere, and His peace is so hard to understand if somebody else is looking in. But when you have that peace, you just get it. So turn to Him in the midst of this. And, I think if we think about being a parent, we'll do anything for our children. I think about sleepless nights if you have a small one, homework assignments last minute, we'll do anything for our children. And I think God is that to us. He wants to fill that void. We just have to be willing to turn to Him, and He's going to just fill you with so much love, very similar to what my pastor said. He'll love you more than your lost loved one can. And that may be hard to understand right now if you're in the midst of that valley. And I'm going to share a verse with you, and you may think as soon as I read it, well, Latashia, that's not very encouraging. Couldn't you have picked a better verse? But bear with me. So this verse is Isaiah 43:2. And it says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. And when you read that at first glance, you're like, well, there's waters and there's fires, and that's very similar to that phone call. That whole day was filled with waters and fires, but He was with me through each part of that. And I think that's the key, and a lot of people will say, well, how do you find encouragement in that? And it's, number one, my God is honest. He never says, okay, come to me and it's going to be easy and it's all going to be perfect. It won't, but he will be there with you. And that's the encouraging piece. I had a friend say once that grief was like a tumbleweed, because she said, some days my feet touch the ground and other days the wind just comes and blows me away. And she had lost her father, after I lost my mom, and that resonated with me, because there are good days. There are days that the water line is high. But what I've learned is God is there with you. He's waiting, and you just have to reach out to him. And one of my favorite quotes, and I found this shortly after I lost my mom, and I've kind of, if it was my quote, I would edit it a little bit. But Vicki Harrison says, grief is like an ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water's calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. And that last part is what I would change, because really we just need to turn to God. Because if you try to swim on your own, it's just going to be like treading water, and you're not going to go anywhere. So to grow through that journey, we have to turn to God to kind of fill that void. So, that was kind of the first lesson. And, it took the Lord a year to kind of give me that lesson, because again, he knew the right timing of when I needed these things through my valley of grief. The next lesson I'm going to share, depending where you're at in your walk with grief, you may be very similar to me when you first heard it, of like, I'm not ready to hear that. But when I turned to God after losing my mom, probably a month or so, I felt the pull, as I shared, to go back to church. And I kind of made the decision that I would go, but I'm going to go to a big church so I can, get lost and people won't really know that I'm there, but I'm going to church, right? So that sermon that day was, don't waste your pain. And I was like, Lord, this is not what I signed up for. And my notes that I took, because if you know me, I'm a note taker, journal taker. There were two things I wrote down, and that was it. So the first one is, it's not about what I've lost, but what I have left. And the second one is, help someone else and don't waste your pain. And that kind of stuck with me, throughout my grief, that stuck of don't waste your pain. But a lot of times people will say, like, well, what does that mean, to not waste your pain? And it's simply this right here, right? It's sharing the story of something that God's brought me through, kind of being able to help others along the way, and being willing to do that, and that's hard sometimes. I've shared the story many times in blog format or Facebook posts, but it wasn't until this year in April that I've actually shared the story for the first time, because it's hard, right? Because I have to start at the beginning of my story, which is telling the story of the loss. I can't just say, okay, well, here in 2021, this is where I'm at. You have to start at the beginning. And there's a life verse that I want to share with you to kind of help you understand, what does that mean to not waste your pain? So that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. And what that says is, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. So when I first came across that verse, it explained it all to me. God has comforted me. He's, as I like to say, patched my hole, that void from my mom. But on the flip side of that, there's an action that he's requiring. So the second part of that verse says, but we may be able to comfort those who are in trouble. And I think that's simply stated, don't waste your pain, right? We take how God comforted us and we show others that same journey through that valley of grief. So I think if you aren't willing to share your story, there's so much that God has probably done for you that you can show others that hope and kind of point them back to the cross of where he's at. So those will be my two life lessons. But how we tie that all together. So if we go back to where we started, with Hebrews 12:1. And those last three words of that verse, set before us. You know, and I read that, probably a couple of weeks ago, and it just jumped out. You know, this walk that I'm on, this valley of grief, I didn't choose that, but he set it before me for a purpose. And I think sometimes, we may not like where we're at. We may not like the valley that he's chosen for us, but it's there for a purpose, and I think mine was kind of twofold. One, he knew it would take that valley to lead me back to him. And two, that it would take that valley for me to be able to put my arm around others and kind of show them the way. I never expected, after I lost my mom, to quickly see so many people with loss. So probably about a month after my mom passed, my husband lost his brother to suicide. And then following that, I had many friends and family that lost either a mother or a father, and I immediately saw that they weren't turning to God, as that source to help them and give them peace. And that became, my testimony and my ministry of helping others through that, to show them the way, the long journey home. And that's why it's kind of called the long journey home, right? Because as I said in the beginning, my mom often called me stubborn, right? So I didn't take the right turn right away, but kind of went about it the long way. And I think we often, whatever you're facing with a loss, it doesn't just have to be the loss of a parent. It could be the loss of a spouse, a child. Maybe it's a prayer that God has never answered, so you're missing something. Or it could be, a relationship that ended. Maybe not through death, but the relationship ended. So all of those are things that you could be grieving. So I would encourage you to, reach out to God as your source of hope. And in that journey, he will give you the peace. He will fill that void. And then in turn, be prepared to share your story to others, to show them along the way, to be an encouragement to them. So, at the ministry that I'm part of, at Finding the More Ministry, we help others find that. We find the more in Jesus, to find that hope. We'd love to have you join our family, and you can do that at findingthemore.org on our website. And we have weekly blogs and podcasts, but probably one of the things that excites me the most is our monthly video series, Moving Forward. And there's various topics, and we've discussed moving forward from grief. It's just about how God helps you in that journey of life. So we would love to have you join us there and visit us there. I would also say, if you're in the midst of the valley of grief, I'd love to be in prayer with you. You can connect with me through Messenger here on Facebook. And also would love to share with you, that hope that he brings, and kind of point you to those things that can fill that void in your life. So I would pray that you will be turning to God for hope and peace in the valley that you're in.